Thank you, Roshi. And I'd like to start with my gratitude to you and also Dokuro Osho and Hokuto Sensei for your guidance and leadership during these difficult times, and for you especially, your support and your recent talks having to do with social justice and meeting the needs of our time through our practice. And so that's what I want to talk about today is my own um, take on meeting our needs through our practice. So as you said, I started sitting in 1996. I was 55 years old at that time. So I had a long history of habits and patterns behind me before I started. Um, I want to first start with a short um, description that I found on Engaged Buddhism because that's where I'm going to get to. And I thought that it was new. I guess when I got started, I agreed with many people that somehow Buddhism was a passive, self self examining practice. But in 1946, Rahula said that been an ethos ever since the time of the Buddha. He encouraged early monks to go out into the community, travel, in order to benefit the largest number of people. And he said his discourses to lay people often included practical instructions on social and economic matters. So this is a long strand within our practice and within our tradition. Um, I guess we reactivate it every era, every year. So, as I said, I was 55 years old when I started here, and I'd already been quite an activist um, throughout my life, probably in a different way than maybe I have been lately. Um, I had struggles with mental health when I was young, and those struggles kind of waylaid me for a while. But even before that, I had become aware of social needs and had gotten involved in social um, activities, such as uh, in 1959, starting when I was about 18, um, we were talking about nuclear disarmament and hoping that our country would lead the way. And so I was living in Iowa in Grinnell College, Grinnell, Iowa, and my friends and I went to demonstrations in Des Moines and saw the FBI on every corner taking our pictures. That was interesting. I had never experienced that before. My father was a little nervous about that because he worked at a university and got federal grants, and he thought he might get retaliated against. But from there, then a couple of years later, I was, as I said, I was waylaid by the mental health issues, and I got married. And during that time, the Vietnam War started, and there was the opportunity to at least go out to demonstrations against the Vietnam War, which even in the Midwest, many of us felt that this was an unjust and wrongheaded war for our country to be engaged in. So I'll just list a few of the things that I have gotten involved in over the years. Um, there was the Vietnam War, which led right into, and it was coexistent with the civil rights period. So I wasn't able to um, do anything active in the country in regard to civil rights, but even though I lived in Nebraska and I had little babies, um, I was very aware of it, and I so yearned to be able to put my body where I wanted to be. And the only thing I could think of to do was to get involved politically at my local precinct level. So I did that, even with small children. And then later, the women's rights movement came along, and there were a few of us in Omaha that were meeting together as a consciousness raising group, and we started getting asked to do talks all over churches all over Omaha about this strange thing called women's liberation, and wouldn't it encourage divorce, and wasn't it a problem with Christian teachings and so on. So we got sort of a really good introduction to trying to defend and talk about causes that affected us. And actually that led into, for me, prison work, because I was involved with the Women's Commission on the Status of Women that set up a prisons and law enforcement committee, and I was on that committee. Part of what we did was we went into the jails and met with women who were in jail. And that was a wonderful era for me, and I was able to bring that about later on in a different way. During this time too, my son was diagnosed with pretty severe emotional disability. So I got involved sort of tangentially and then very, very actively in the disability rights movement and the movement of parents who were fighting the systems that existed and trying to make real change in the lives of their sons and daughters. And I saw these parents go from being very shy, inward-looking people to fierce advocates who were so articulate and so effective in making changes. So I saw a lot of that kind of how activism empowered the people that were involved in it. And finally, I was involved for quite a few years with GLBT activism. And during those times, there were all kinds of ways that I explored for working with change, training, teaching, supporting other people's leadership in the disability rights movement. It really wasn't I didn't have a disability, I thought. But I could support and help people who did have disabilities to learn simple things like voting, which maybe they'd never had a chance to do, or choosing their leaders and learning to give speaking, to do public speaking and so on. There was a huge amount of work that could be done in supporting other people. So that was part of it. I got involved in risking arrest. I never got arrested, but I supported people that were doing that. And both in disability movement activism, we went to Washington, D.C., and you've never seen anything like a line of maybe half a mile long of people using wheelchairs rolling down the streets in Washington, D.C. toward the Supreme Court, and then surrounding it and blocking it and getting arrested, or going to Newt Gingrich's apartment building and blocking all the entrances, and just to make a point and being heard and getting heard that way. So those were all really exciting times, and that whole movement activity was really exciting for me. It's a feeling like no other. Just that engagement. It's not about oneself. It's about what we want to do to make changes. So I think that along with that, I realized after I became Buddhist that there's a kind of attachment to the idea that if I do these things or if we do these things together, real change will happen. And I never was quite of the belief that this major revolution was going to be happening. Like many of the people that I knew, even in Nebraska, felt that, you know, this was the beginning of a revolution and everything would change. I didn't believe that, but I thought changes would happen maybe on a greater scale than they did. So during those years, I also saw lots of pushback and counter activity and counter activism. And that's really disappointing. So fast forward to 1996, which isn't that fast now, it's 24 years ago. I was at a point where there was nothing wrong with my life, but something in me was telling me that I needed to explore some kind of a spiritual tradition. And I thought meditation would be safe, simple, just learn to meditate. And so I tried it with a book, and that I wasn't very satisfied with my practice then. In fact, I didn't feel good about it at all because my mind just wandered all over the place. So a friend of mine, Jikyo Celia Euler, lived near me, and she was involved here at the Zen Center. And she encouraged me to get involved and meet Shinge Roshi. And Shinge Roshi encouraged me to learn to meditate at Hendricks Chapel. I worked at Syracuse University by that time. And from there, come to the Zen Center. So I did. And I kind of learned through the exposure to this practice that I needed to question all my previous patterns, and so I started doing that, and I kind of stepped back from a lot of the activism. In my mind, it felt like stepping back because I wasn't doing as much, and recognizing how much of it sometimes was based on people's egos, or sometimes based in anger and self-righteousness and all kinds of activities or emotions that lead nowhere and certainly are not able to bring about the right kind of change. So this practice really allowed me to do that. But it allowed me to step back and try to find a way, and try to understand whether I even could find a way to be effective and to do this work without getting away to anger and self-righteousness and so on. And there was so much in this practice without ever hearing the word engaged Buddhism or anything. There was so much guidance that was available. Guidance from Roshi. She encouraged involvement and never stood in the way of it. And then guidance from the teachings like the Four Noble Truths and the precepts. If you really look at the precepts, they tell you everything you need to work on in order to engage effectively with other people and with justice activities. So I think before I came to this practice, I learned mostly to rely on rational thinking and not to identify some of the negative patterns that had to do with emotional expression. And certainly I believed that people were intuitive, but I didn't feel that I had any intuitive abilities. And so I just relied on rational mind. And this practice helped me to get beyond that and to see that we could all develop qualities like intuitive knowing, like compassion that's based on not in ego, but in just connection with other people. So at the same time, I was really just, I think, for a good long time, just kind of exploring these things. And then in 2005, I was asked to teach meditation at the local jail, pretrial detention facility, which is, we call it the Justice Center, and it's not really, there's not so much justice there, although people definitely try to be respectful and so on. And that was a wonderful opportunity. So I was able to go into the jail on a regular basis, and I've been doing that ever since until the COVID crisis started. And that really, for one thing, it was full circle, going back to the prison work that I'd been doing in the 70s, but also that feeling of just being able to connect with all kinds of people who happened to be in jail, mostly because they couldn't afford to pay bail, sometimes because they had committed some kind of really serious crime, but very often it was, for one thing, we didn't necessarily know who had done what or who was in there for what reason. We were just connecting with each other as individuals, as people, and that became something very rich to me. Then later in 2008, I started at Auburn Prison. They wanted one of the men there wanted a Buddhist Sangha to develop, and they wrote to us and asked if we would help them. They had to have an outside Buddhist volunteer. So Shinge Roshi again encouraged me to do that, and I've done that with quite a few different Sangha members over the time, and with a woman in Ithaca who is also a Buddhist. And that has just been such a rich experience as well. The problem is when you get involved in jails or any kind of institutions, really, you can't help but see injustice. And so what do you do? So in Syracuse, we have a wonderful organization that the Zen Center is a part of. It's called ACTS, ACTS. It means Alliance of Communities Transforming Syracuse. And they are a faith-based social justice organization. So that was a really wonderful avenue that the Zen Center kind of, laid out for me. And Mokuon is also a member, she's our representative with ACTS. And they had a prison or a criminal justice committee. So I had a way to get involved in advocacy without being out in the forefront of it. And that was just a wonderful experience as well, and led to many other things. So what I wanted to do was talk about a couple of the things that I've gotten involved in just in the last couple of years since, since 2016. So when the election came, that was just a shock. And I realized how little I still knew. And I mean, why would I be shocked except because I didn't know the level and depth of not just injustice, but systemic problems in our country that affected and the conditioning of all of us. So we're all conditioned to be unfair, to be racist, to be setting ourselves against each other. And that, along with my involvement in ACTS, really inspired me to get involved more deeply. So some of the things that I've been doing since I got involved with ACTS have to do with getting involved with real relationships with people that are sort of non-white. So I was encouraged to um, I went to a talk at the First Unitarian Universalist Church by one of the Black Lives Matters leaders, and the point that she really made was that yes, white people can do things, but follow Black leadership. And so, of course, in my disability work, I was used to that, but I hadn't really ever tried that, as far as I could remember, with African American people or with other groups of people. And so I sought out, based on one of my friends' guidance, the National Action Network, which is led by and mostly African American people. And also through ACTS, we started attracting some African American people who were really interested in doing something active on the ground. So those experiences showed me that there are so many ways in which our cultures are sort of white dominant ways of doing things aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily engage people that aren't white. And we often think that the way we do things, the way we run a meeting, the kinds of actions we want to take are for the benefit of other people, but without their involvement, it's meaningless. And so I'd seen over and over people leaving, people who weren't white leaving organizations and not knowing why, until I joined organizations like NAN and saw that there's so much more attention. For example, I'll just give one example, so much more attention on relationships between people and stopping the agenda if a conflict comes up, to allow the conflict to really be explored and to allow the relationship to be repaired rather than just sweeping it under the rug or saying, well, we've got to go to the next agenda item. So these were small things that I started seeing, and I thought, well, no wonder these other organizations keep losing people. We need to learn different ways of doing things. So when I first went to NAN, I was a little nervous, and I asked the secretary, I said, is it okay if I come back? And she was extremely welcoming and said yes. And what I found there and in other activities that I've been involved in this last 4 years is so much love, welcoming with love, that it has been heartwarming and wonderful, and also shows me that we have another way that we can do things. We don't have to do things the way that we're conditioned into doing them. So I'm so glad that the Zen Study Society is finally, well, I shouldn't say finally because it's always been there, but we're formalizing our commitment to engage Buddhism in many different ways. So I wanted to kind of end up, before I end with my last quote, talking a little bit about that. So we have an Engaged Buddhism committee that's been just 4 people doing all this work to get things ready. And you can find it on our website now, the Zen Study Society website. And there are several things that I just wanted to point out. One is that there's going to be a Wednesday evening meetings led by Jifu, Devyani Saad. And the first one starts Wednesday, August 5th at 7 p.m. And everyone's invited to that. It's just a way to start having a discussion about some of these issues. Secondly, a book discussion that Daisho uh, John Corso is leading, starting Sunday, August 9th. And the discussion group is on the book, How to Be Anti-Racist. It's a wonderful book and a really great opportunity for all of us, because I think part of it is we do need to learn and we do need to talk about the effects of these things on ourselves and how we've bought into them and how we've perpetuated them and how we can go beyond that before we just go out and, offer ourselves as, I know what to do and I'm your savior sort of a mentality. There's a racial solidarity Sangha with Kanchi, Lucia Oliva Henley, Kanchi, and Zweekend, Inago Scott Rebellon. They're co-leading that, and that will be happening Wednesday, August 12th at 7 p.m. And I think a lot of this is being put in the chat. And then there's a study group on the Poor People's Campaign, which has been adopted by the Zen Studies Society. And that happens on Wednesday, August 19th at 7. And that'll be led by Yuki Eric Michaels. So I think I wanted to point out that we've got lots and lots of resources now on the Zen Studies Society website, including a whole list of activities one can get involved in to address the needs that are popping up, revealing themselves because of the COVID-19 crisis, and then many, many, many book resources and web resources that you can access to start learning or to further your learning about all of this. So I wanted to end because I've been doing a lot of reading myself. I was going to tell a joke, I might as well tell it. So my way all of my life has been, when something comes up, I need to study it. I need to read all about it. So when I was pregnant, I read all kinds of books about being pregnant and having babies. And actually, it was probably a good thing that I did that. But as soon as I had a baby, read about it. Not just do it, but read about it, learn about it. And so for many of us, that's our way of entering into something and doing more. So I wanted to, because I mentioned love, and often we don't use that word, or we see it as a sentimental word, and yet it's so critical. And what I found when I entered African American led organizations was a greater emphasis and openness about love. So Bell Hooks is an African American, now elder, feminist, womanist writer who's been writing about race issues for so many years. She's also Buddhist. And she says that there was a recent article in Lion's Roar that she wrote, and it really was about love. So she said, we felt that we had failed to create a culture of peace and justice through all of our activist activities. It's still this big failure. So it led us back to an introspective search of our intimate relations. How could any of us truly believe that we could create world peace when we couldn't make peace in our own relationships with our families, friends, neighbors, and community? So she says, visionary teachers like Martin Luther King, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, Sharon Salzberg were moved by spiritual necessity to speak more directly about the practice of love. And then she went on to quote Thich Nhat Hanh poem, quote, "When I knew how to love, the doors of my heart opened wide before the wind. Reality was calling out for revolution." And she says, that spirit of revolution, that call to practice transformative love, captured her critical imagination And now that she said that, I realize it also captures mine. So thank you very much.